Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 4 of Plato's Republic. So this book picks up where Book 3 leaves off, but we have a specific challenge that's actually launched here at the beginning of Book 4. Adeimantus basically challenges Socrates on the premise that the goal of the ideal city, Callipolis, is to make people happy, or as happy as possible. But the guardians live under all of these restrictions, like they don't have excess money, they don't get to feast on fine foods. They're basically servants of the people, etc., etc. And so Adeimantus gives this critique that it seems that the guardians would be unhappy. So why would they want to serve in the way that Socrates is envisioning that they serve? And Socrates gives us rather a utilitarian response. So the utilitarianism develops in the 18th century, I think, late 18th century, really 19th century. It's sort of heyday with people like John Stuart Mill. But basically the premise of utilitarianism, vastly simplified, is that what's best for society is what produces the maximum amount of happiness or the maximum amount of good for the maximum amount of people. And this is essentially what Socrates says here, because he clarifies, we aren't aiming to make any one group outstandingly happy, but to make the whole city so as far as possible. So that's the goal Socrates sets here. Is essentially what makes the city maximally happy is the best thing. So that's the way in which the guardians are going to become the most happy. Because as he talks about earlier, I think in book 3, really, he says here, that we must choose from among our guardians those men who, upon examination, seem most of all to believe throughout their lives that they must eagerly pursue what is advantageous to the city and be wholly unwilling to do the opposite. So the selflessness of the guardians, the selflessness of the people who are chosen as guardians, is what will guarantee their happiness is maximized by the city's happiness being maximized. So this is sort of the core component here. And there's a number of things that Socrates presents as ways to maximize the good of the city. One of which I find extremely striking, because it actually, like, there are ways in which, in some sense, Socrates almost anticipates Karl Marx. But very strikingly, he does not. But there are things that look like they're kind of Marxist. So, for instance, Socrates makes a critique of economic extremes. People should neither be too wealthy, because they'll become lazy and unwilling to work. They won't hone their crafts that they're responsible for, etc., etc. But they also shouldn't be too poor, because if they're poor, they will not have adequate tools or not have adequate training, because they won't be able to afford it, and so their craft will suffer. So in the ideal city, there will be a sort of economic moderation where everybody will be financially comfortable without being wealthy, without being impoverished. And the other key thing, and Socrates comes back to this over and over and over again throughout the Republic, is the idea that everyone should be responsible for doing what they are best suited for. And for Socrates, and probably Plato, this is almost a biological thing in ways that become increasingly problematic in the next couple of books. But he says here, and the one we mentioned earlier is even easier. This is a guideline for the Callipolis. And the one we mentioned earlier is even easier, when we said that if an offspring of the guardians is inferior, he must be sent to join the other citizens, and that if the others have an able offspring, he must join the guardians. This was meant to make clear that each of the other citizens is to be directed to what he is naturally suited for, so that doing the one work that is his own, he will become not many but one, and the whole city will itself be naturally one, not many. So this is an interesting idea. And again, this is a utilitarian kind of idea. The idea that everyone should do the task that they are best suited for. There are some problems here that Plato doesn't really, or that Socrates doesn't really account for. One is how you actually determine who is best suited for a particular task, or what task a person is best suited for. And to a certain extent, Socrates is simply not interested in that. Like, within the broad scope of there's the guardians, there's the soldiers, there's everybody else, craftspeople, farmers, merchants, etc., Socrates doesn't give a shit beyond those broad categories. So if somebody is superior, they go up to guardian status. If somebody is a great warrior, they become a soldier. Everybody else, who cares? Peasant, worker, class. So to a certain extent, Socrates is not interested in the question of, is Jim more suited to be a potter or a carpenter or a shoemaker? That's simply not something Socrates gives any fucks about. But if the entire premise of this Callipolis, this ideal city, is that everyone does the task that they're best suited for, you actually need some mechanism for figuring that out. The other big problem, and Socrates gives us no sense of how to do that. The other big problem is that there's no mechanism for what happens if nobody is suited for doing a particular necessary task. And actually, this does come up to a certain extent later on when Socrates is discussing the philosopher kings, because he says it's incredibly rare that you would actually get a philosopher king who meets all of his criteria. But like, if you think about this in a practical way, like, what if nobody in the city, and Socrates does say the city's size should be kept relatively small. What if nobody has an aptitude for pottery? Like, if you're in the ancient world, if you're in ancient Greece, you need pottery. Like, that's non-negotiable, really. Like, your society requires that in order to function. It's a basic component of material culture. If nobody is good at making pots, your society still needs somebody to be a potter. So this idea of everybody should do the task that they're most naturally suited for can potentially produce issues. Because if everybody is naturally suited for something other than making pottery, you are without a necessary thing for that society to function. So I think these are issues that Socrates is simply unconcerned about in many ways, in ways that are problematic. But there are other things here, because again, the fundamental question of Book 4 is how you maximize the city's happiness. And ultimately, one of Socrates' key answers is that the city should promote positive virtues. And for Socrates, there are four major virtues that the city needs to develop, which are wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And in sort of the middle to latter portion of Book 4, Socrates goes through and defines what each of those are in the context of the city. And it's striking, though perhaps not surprising, that each of these virtues is primarily associated with the guardian class, whether that's the sort of political rulers that Socrates will later define as the philosopher kings, or the soldiers. The only virtue that really also applies to the working class or peasant class is moderation. And that primarily consists in this context of them accepting the rule of the guardians. So moderation for the guardians is largely, I will accept ruling over this city-state, and moderation for everybody else is largely, I will accept being ruled over. So again, this is one of the areas where Socrates very clearly diverges from Karl Marx. But wisdom is primarily located with the political class. Courage is primarily located with the military class. Moderation located with all tiers of society. And then justice is not necessarily located in any specific class, because what Socrates kind of comes down on is this idea that then it turns out that this doing one's own work, provided that it comes to be in a certain way, is justice. And he later sort of restates this. Or is it above all the fact that every child, woman, slave, free man, craftsman, ruler, and ruled, each does his own work and doesn't meddle with what is other people's? He again reiterates this point slightly later when he says, therefore, from this point of view also, the having and doing of one's own would be accepted as justice. So this is kind of the central idea that he really develops in Book 4 in terms of how the city runs, is ultimately that justice, which again is the central question in a way of the Republic. What is justice? Justice in the city-state is everyone sticking in their own spot. This is very Confucian, actually. This idea that everyone has a particular place in society, and you maximize social stability, organization, overall good by everyone existing and sort of remaining within the social role that they are assigned, and doing that to the best of their ability. This is the core idea, in some ways, of Confucius's philosophy coming out of China around actually the same time as Socrates. So that's an interesting point. And again, it ties into this overall sort of authoritarian element to the Callipolis, to the ideal city. This is a highly, highly regimented society. Very little freedom of choice, very little individual rights, etc., etc. This is a society that is organized on an extraordinarily hierarchical basis. So that's the key sort of political insight of Book 4. But the book ends with a discussion of how this is reflected in the individual soul. Because that's earlier in the Republic, Book 1 especially, that's what sort of prompts the overall discussion here, is the question of what justice looks like in the individual. And Socrates gives us this idea that, like the city, which consists of the working / peasant class, the military class, and the enlightened rulers, that there are three parts to the individual soul as well that correspond to these three. So there's the appetitive component, which is I'm hungry, thirsty, and horny. That corresponds to the working peasant class that wants to make money, that wants to eat food, wants to have a comfortable life, etc., etc. There's the spirited part, which is the I am enraged by whatever I'm enraged by. That corresponds to the military class or the army. And then there's the rational part. I am thoughtful and I can restrain my lower impulses. And that's the intellectual rulers, the philosopher kings. And so Plato, Socrates, basically this is the id, the ego, and the superego in Freudian terms. This sort of tripartite division of the soul in Socrates or Plato's terms, the psyche in Freudian terms. The id, the ego, and the superego function along similar lines. So that's striking. And what Socrates sort of ultimately comes down on toward the end of Book 4 is that justice in the individual, like in the city, consists of these three parts functioning in the ways in which they should. So the appetitive portion of the soul should push the individual toward sustaining themselves, basic maintenance, things like this. The spirited part should push them toward courage, but the rational part should rule the individual and should constrain the lower impulses. And the lower impulses should seek to be constrained by the rational part of the soul. So this, for Socrates, is justice in the individual in much the same way that it's justice in the city. There's one other thing that I find interesting in this book. And it's interesting largely because of what later European and North American, especially US, culture has made of Greco-Roman material remains. Socrates says here at the very beginning of Book 4, "Suppose then that someone came up to us while we were painting a statue and objected that, because we had painted the eyes, which are the most beautiful part, black rather than purple, we had not applied the most beautiful colors to the most beautiful parts of the statue." Now, what's interesting about that? Well, in the Victorian era, in the 19th century, and to a certain extent in the 18th century as well, Europeans and later Americans who were very interested in the classics scrubbed off the remnants of paint on a lot of statues. We now often think of Greco-Roman statues as these white marble statues, but originally they weren't. They were painted, often in what many of us in the Anglo-American tradition would consider very gaudy colors. They were very bright, lots of blues, lots of reds, lots of yellows. They were not the sort of staid, sober white marble that we tend to associate with the Greco-Roman classics. And that's significant because a lot of work is now starting to be done among classicists about how color functioned in the ancient world, especially among the Greeks and Romans, because white supremacists have pointed to these white marbles as evidence that for the Greeks and the Romans, white was the most beautiful. The problem, of course, with that line of reasoning is that the Greeks and Romans did not see these as white statues. We see them as white statues because in the 18th and 19th centuries, people scrubbed off the remnants of the paint that had survived for thousands of years. But for the Greeks and Romans, these were extremely colorful statues. So that undermines this sort of white supremacist or white nationalist argument that's often made about how classical culture valorized whiteness. And of course, the Greeks and Romans did not have the same conception of the white race that we do today. Race is a social construct, and the way that it's conceptualized in different societies varies extremely. But Socrates is here telling us very directly, these statues were painted. These statues were not white. They were not the white marble that we see and associate with classical antiquity. So that's really significant in terms of understanding Greco-Roman material culture.